Hi, welcome to Israel, Islam and End Times. I'm Daniel Secomb, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Ryan Jones from Israel Today. How are you, Ryan?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Daniel.
First question, give us a bit of an introduction to Israel Today and how you came to be involved with it.
Israel Today started about 40 years ago in Germany by a Messianic Jewish family that had made Aliyah to the land. And this was around the time that the church in Germany had come to a greater awareness not only of what Germany had done to the Jews, but what they as a church in Germany had a responsibility to do in response to the Jewish nation and to the state of Israel in particular. So there was a real void, a real lack of information in Germany at that time, of information coming out of Israel, and specifically information from a perspective of believers in the land. So they started the magazine to fill that void. About 15 years ago, they branched out into English. There was a lot of reporting in English about Israel, but it's generally very poor and biased. So they decided to branch out into English in order to counter some of that bias, to fill in the gaps that the mainstream media was leaving. I started at the magazine about 7 years ago. I was first working almost exclusively on the website, writing daily news reports, but I've since moved into the role of English editor, magazine editor.
It's no secret that Israel has been the target of intense scrutiny and bias in the media. In your opinion, just how bad do you think it really is?
Well, Daniel, sometimes it's just really unbelievable. I mean, it's just beyond, it's surreal almost how bad it is. And we saw this with the Gaza war about a year and a half ago, where the reports coming out of Gaza when the mainstream media would go in there just didn't seem to match reality whatsoever. And at that point, a lot of the mainstream media reporters would come back out of Gaza, back into Israel proper, and even admit on their Twitter feeds and their Facebook pages that they had been under intimidation and threat while in Gaza, and almost hinting to their audience that everything you read about what we reported while we were there, you should take with a grain of salt. So it's pretty bad, and there's a clear agenda. I used to have a colleague at Israel Today, a fellow American, and she had come from a mainstream media background working with the Associated Press. And so she would go out with the Foreign Media Association in Israel whenever a major event would happen. And she related that on one of those trips, down to the Gaza Strip in fact, she was sitting behind several of the mainstream media reporters from the BBC, Reuters, AP, wherever. And on the bus ride down, before they ever got there, they were already discussing how they were going to paint this particular story. They hadn't even arrived. They hadn't even heard the facts, either from Israelis or Palestinians, but they already had an agenda. They already had a story in mind. And so they were going to make the facts fit that story.
Israeli news outlet Ynet said in the Gaza war in 2014, they said that in Europe, the photo of a dead Palestinian is worth more than 1,000 Israeli words. Just how much truth is there to that statement?
Well, first of all, in regards to Israel warning its enemies, trying to care for its enemies in a really unbelievable way that you don't see from any other nation in the world, even Western Christian nations. And we often joke that Israel, in its actions at least in times of war, is in fact the most Christian nation in the world in the way that it treats its enemies and tries to reach out to help others that it doesn't necessarily need to help. So Israel goes out of its way, but one of the arguments that always comes up during these Gaza wars and various other conflicts is it doesn't seem to matter what we do, how hard we try to care for our enemies, the world's going to come against us anyway. So during the Gaza war, the media bias again started to become very apparent, not only in that foreign reporters were on the edge of admitting that they were committing bias while they were in Gaza because they felt threatened, but because, as you mentioned, we saw all of these photos going out on social media and even in mainstream media reports of supposedly dead Gazans. And the thing is that only a small portion of them were actually from Gaza. They were taking pictures from Syria, they were taking pictures from Iraq, other places around the region, and presenting them as Palestinians. And it was very easy to prove later because these pictures had been reprocessed, they had been recycled, they had been used before. But it didn't seem to matter, You get the picture out, everyone is in an uproar about what Israel has done, and then they move on. And so it's had its negative impact, it's had its negative effect, and it doesn't matter that it was false after the fact. And so it's very frustrating for Israel, and it's very true. This is very true. A picture of a dead Palestinian, even if it isn't a Palestinian, is worth more than 1,000 Israeli words, and it's a very true statement.
Just how much is the spiritual dynamic come into play here?
I think in particular to this issue with the false photos, you can already there see the spiritual dynamic that they're just willing to accept untruth. They're willing to accept blatant lies, even though you can prove that they're lies, because there is an agenda against Israel. And you see it again with the media focus on Israel. Why in the world should this one tiny nation and this one relatively small conflict, I mean, if you look at the dozen other conflicts around the globe, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is relatively minor, both in terms of the land that we're talking about and the casualty figures. And yet, Israel has more foreign reporters on the ground than anywhere in the world but Washington, D.C. Why is this? What is with the disproportionate focus on Israel? What is the motive behind this obsession with Israel? And nobody can give you a good answer when you go out there and ask the mainstream media or ask abroad. But as a Bible believer, it's pretty clear. God has a focus on Israel, and his enemies have a focus on Israel.
What do you think are some of the most misunderstood truths about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that the West just doesn't get?
This goes back to the question about media bias in general. And more often than not, we have found that the media doesn't necessarily tell you outright lies, although sometimes they do, as with these false photos from Gaza. But what happens more often than not is that they tell you the basics of the story, but they leave out key and critical elements. And without those elements, they paint a totally different picture than the reality on the ground. And we have found this often when we go and for instance, interview Palestinians, your average Palestinians on the ground, about different aspects of the peace process, the Oslo peace process. And you do have to differentiate between an older generation of Palestinians, 20, 30 and over, and a younger generation, 20 and younger, because that younger generation has grown up under the PLO, has grown up under the Oslo peace process, and so has been systematically educated to view the Jews as their enemy, to hate the Jews. But if you speak to the older generation, you'll very often be told that we don't have a problem with the Jews. We used to live and get along with the Jews and coexist with the Jews here on the ground. And I'm talking about the settlers, the ones that the media will paint as the primary obstacle to peace. And these Palestinians will tell you, there wasn't a problem before, and in many places there still isn't a problem. They live together, they work together, and there is genuine coexistence. And so a lot of these Palestinians will turn to us as Israelis interviewing them and wonder, why did you Israelis bring the PLO here? Whose bright idea was that? And the PLO was the Al-Qaeda of its day. It would be like putting Osama bin Laden when he was still alive in charge of a peace process. It's just craziness. But that's what the world did in its own wisdom in trying to solve the Middle East conflict. And your average Palestinian is just not on board with this. Even if they might have been 20 years ago when it first started, they've seen the reality now. And even those who will say, we want a Palestinian state, they'll also say, we're not on a very good path towards reaching that goal. In general, they get along with the Jews that live in their midst. And again, I'm talking about the settlers who are painted as bad guys or painted as obstacles to peace. And so these are just some of the key and critical elements left out of stories in the mainstream media, that if you knew about that, it would paint a pretty different picture from what the media is telling you.
Does Palestinian culture and values reflect very similar to Western values and culture?
Well, Islamic culture and values don't reflect very well Western values and culture, because we're talking about a Judeo-Christian society, well, at least underneath, at least what it was based on, in Islamic culture on the other side. So the values are different, but your average person, whether you're talking about a Palestinian Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, whoever, your average person just wants to live peacefully, quietly, prosperously. And, so 99% of even these Palestinians that we talk to, they wouldn't dream of exercising violence against Israelis. But there's an agenda there. There's an agenda to sow conflict, and the media is part of that. And ultimately, as we spoke about, for a Bible believer, it's easy to see that it's a spiritual agenda. And part of sowing conflict is to misrepresent the situation within the media, so that the world is then saying, well, the Jews are the bad guys and the Palestinians have been oppressed and repressed. And then the Palestinians themselves begin to believe that. And you sow conflict where there wasn't necessarily any before.
To what extent do you believe that the church has fallen for this Palestinian propaganda?
I believe that the church has fallen pretty big for the Palestinian propaganda. And I believe a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are dealing today with a younger generation of Christians who are less rooted in the scriptures, and especially the scriptures of the Old Testament than their parents' generation was. And that skews their reading and their perception of Israel, of the nation of Israel today, and its relation to scripture and to prophecy. And instead of being rooted in scripture, this generation of Christians is far more rooted in their liberal, politically correct society. And so the Palestinian propaganda plays on that. It says, this is an oppressed people. This is a people that needs social activism and social justice. And, that's what you Christians do, so.
Do you believe that replacement theology has actually contributed to that?
I believe replacement theology has a lot to do with it, but I also believe that replacement theology has very cleverly and effectively exploited that by repackaging itself as a social activism movement in our day and for this particular generation. And a large part of that is what's known as Palestinian liberation theology, which takes, in short, takes replacement theology, which says that all of the promises made to Israel now belong to the church. And it goes a step further by saying those specific promises regarding land now belong to the Palestinian church. And it wraps the whole thing in a package of social activism, the oppressed who need your assistance and are Christians. And it's very appealing to a generation that is steeped in this type of social activism and liberalism.
Do you feel that Israel today is actually making a difference in dispelling the lies and misinformation in regard to Israel and the Jewish people in the Western Church today?
I think so. I hope so. We do hear back from readers often that, various different stories had opened their eyes to what was really happening on the ground. And I gave you a couple of examples, just when you actually go and speak to the people who are really involved, rather than just listening to the media, it begins to paint a slightly different picture, and sometimes a very different picture. But one of the messages that we're really trying to push, kind of under the surface, is that, it's said that the Jews have a veil over their eyes when it comes to Jesus, to Yeshua. Well, the fact of the matter is that much of the church has a veil over its eyes when it comes to Israel. And until that veil is lifted, the church really can't be a fully effective witness to the Jewish people. So the two go hand in hand. And we're trying to get people to that point of understanding and realization, not by directly preaching it, but by trying, first of all, to dispel the misrepresentation in the media, because that's kind of where it begins. They see these negative reports about Israel, and already the thought process begins, well, Israel is not the good guys. And then, you bring in the replacement theology and the Palestinian liberation theology, and you have, well, I'm a Christian, so I need to support the oppressed. It's just a slippery slope, and towards a very negative theological position on Israel.
What would you consider to be some of the other big challenges for the Israel Today publication?
One of the biggest challenges for Israel today is to kind of navigate the waters of the worldwide church and of the Messianic community in Israel, because there's a lot of division, there's a lot of different views on prophecy and what's happening with and in Israel. And so we have to navigate those waters a little bit so that we can try to reach everybody in our efforts to dispel this misrepresentation of the Jewish state. And so we really present ourselves as, we're not part of this ministry, we're not part of that ministry. We are an Israeli news agency that is run by Messianics. So to hold on to that position is sometimes a challenge, but we work at it. Yeah.
How has Israel Today been received by the church in the West?
We have several different audiences within the West. Our primary subscriber base is in Germany. That's, as I said, that's where the magazine began. So the church there has really accepted it. Kind of across the board in different denominations. Because as I said, 40 years ago there was very little information in Germany from Israel, and in particular from believers in the land. So it's really filled a void there. In places like Holland and Norway, it has been largely accepted by the church in those nations, the evangelical Protestant churches in those nations, as again, kind of filling a void that was left by their own local media when it comes to Israel. And in particular in Holland, the Christians there seem to still have a very good rapport with the government itself, but also with the Israeli representatives in the country. And the Christians who are using Israel Today and who are behind the publication of Israel Today in that nation have used the magazine to influence Israeli representatives there in Holland, who then go and influence the government of Holland. So we're very happy with that.
Ryan, in regard to the BDS threat, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which is gaining a lot of traction at the moment, especially in Europe, just how bad do you think that could get? And what is the Israel Today publication doing to minimise that?
Well, the fact of the matter is that BDS to Israel is at this stage more of an annoyance. Economically, it's not having a tremendous impact on Israel. It's more the idea behind BDS that's troubling to Israel and to Israelis. At the same time, it is having an enormous economic impact on the Palestinians, because the Israeli farms and factories that are being targeted by BDS, by and large, employ Palestinian workers. And SodaStream was a very good example of this. They had one of their major factories just east of Jerusalem in the so-called occupied territories. And they had a staff of around 500 in that factory, half of whom were Palestinian Arabs. And during the time that pressure was increasing, BDS pressure was increasing on SodaStream, we went to interview some of these workers. And we asked them, is it problematic for you to work here as a Palestinian? Don't you feel these people stole your land, et cetera? So kind of playing the devil's advocate a little bit. But by and large, they told us, not only are we paid more here than we would be paid by any Palestinian employer, but we kind of like working here together with the Jews. We get along. It was a real example of coexistence. Now, ultimately, this factory bowed to the pressure of BDS and moved to within Israel proper, and all of these Palestinians lost their jobs. And that's kind of an example of what's happening across the board. Every time one of these Israeli businesses has to move, Palestinians are losing their jobs. The Israeli business will remain in business and find new workers across the Green Line. So when you go in and interview your average Palestinian about BDS, again, the Palestinians living there, almost all of them oppose BDS, which sounds like a strange thing to say because the way it's presented in the media, and there are many Palestinians within the BDS movement, but almost all of them live abroad. The ones living on the ground, even those who will say, again, my goal is a Palestinian state, will also tell you, until a Palestinian state comes about, I'd like to have work. And so BDS is just opposed almost across the board, which again is completely left out of mainstream media reports regarding this phenomenon.
What kind of a positive impact do you believe that the Israel Today publication is actually having in the community abroad?
I think Israel Today is having a positive impact on the Western Church, those within the Western Church that read it, by helping to explain and paint a fuller picture of what is happening on the ground, and helping to equip them to then go out and explain to others how the mainstream media is misrepresenting the picture in Israel, and as a result to help to steer more Christians away from this social activism flavor of replacement theology.
What are some of the practical ways that people can get involved to support the Israel Today publication?
Well, first of all, obviously, you can subscribe to the magazine. We publish monthly. We do have online daily updates on our website, israeltoday.co.il. The monthly magazine will then include more in-depth feature kind of background and analysis pieces to further explain, what's happening on a day-to-day basis. We also have a number of social aid programs that people can get involved with, helping IDF soldiers in particular during times of conflict, helping Israeli children, helping Holocaust survivors. So there are a number of programs that we do that people can get involved with on our website.
Ryan, you report often about the Messianic community. What changes have you observed that has been happening since you've been there in the land?
Well, I've seen what I feel are some exciting changes within the Messianic body since I've been there in the past 20 years. I really feel that when I got there, I was kind of coming in at the tail end of a generation that was a little bit more quiet about who they were as believers in public for various reasons. Many of them were immigrants to the land and of course came in with a very survivalist mentality, which you need to do to survive in Israel. And many of them were still engaged in a kind of identity crisis because they understood that they belonged to the worldwide church, to the church in general. But there was also this attitude of, well, if you believe in Jesus, then you're no longer a Jew. And of course that was dear to, their Jewishness was dear to them. So it was this identity crisis pulling them in both directions. I'm happy to say that I've seen over the past 20 years that the younger generation, the children of these immigrants and those who grew up and were born as Israeli Messianic Jews, by and large don't carry the baggage that their parents carried. They have nothing to prove to anyone regarding their Jewishness or the fact that they're an Israeli. And so many of them are far more bold with their faith. And this is happening right around the same time that Israeli society in general is far more accepting of the Messianic community as a part, even an integral part of the nation itself. And oftentimes today too, you open up Israeli newspapers and you see them now use the term Messianic Jew, whereas in the past they'd use various other terms to indicate this person was Jewish but believes in Jesus, so is no longer Jewish. So today you more often see them use Messianic Jew, an acceptance of the fact that they're Israeli, they believe in Yeshua, and they're still Jews. So there's been a real shift in the attitude in Israeli society in general. And again, this is happening right around the same time that a young generation of Messianics is coming up that is far more bold in its faith, and they're latching onto the opportunity to be a witness to the nation. So one example of this was about a year ago on Israel's most popular televised singing competition. There was a young contestant named Shai Sol, and she's a Messianic Jewess. And in the pre-competition interviews that each contestant needed to give, they were supposed to tell something special and unique in their lives. And without batting an eye, with no hesitation, this young girl got in front of the camera and said, well, I believe in Yeshua. That's pretty unique. And the two hosts conducting the interview said, well, you mean you're a Christian? She said, no, I'm a Jew and I believe in Yeshua. I said, no, but Christians believe in Jesus. She said, no, Yeshua was a Jew. Without us Jews, without the word that God gave through our people, there would be no concept of a Messiah. So I am a Jew and I believe in Yeshua. And one of the hosts, who was a well-known ultra-liberal homosexual activist in Israel, he kind of said, well, that's all fine and good, but, keep it to yourself. Don't share that when you go out on stage and whatnot. The other host, who was a popular Israeli model, and now without understanding really what she was saying, she shot back and said, what are you talking about? Of course she should go tell that to everyone. She should share that with everyone. That's who she is. And again, she didn't understand, really what she was saying in terms of being a witness. But what was amazing to me was, again, this was Israel's most popular televised singing competition. So almost every Jewish household in the nation would have been tuned into this broadcast. The entire nation witnessed this exchange between a Messianic Jewess and these two hosts. So that's an example of kind of where the younger generation of Messianics are today. They're willing to share, they're open with their faith, and you see it in the military, you see it in the IDF as well, and it's an exciting thing to watch. We're talking about small numbers, of course. The influence is still minor. It's still in its infancy, but it's starting.
Ryan, thank you so much for coming onto Israel, Islam and End Times. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Daniel.